today's topic is boundaries. And boundaries is one of the things that codependents really need to learn about. Boundaries we typically think about is about saying no, but boundaries is really so much more. And one of my preferred ways of looking at boundaries is, it is what is you and what is not you. What do you want to be part of your life and what do you not want to be part of your life? And part of the codependent problem is that we get ourselves mixed up with other people. We don't know where we end and the rest of the world begins, and vice versa. We don't know, we don't realize, we're not aware of when the world steps into our personal space. So knowing and learning about boundaries is really beginning to learn about who you are and what is inside your space. And I'm using my hands here to describe it because one easy way to think about boundaries is when you think about your aura, your energy field, it kind of expands out to the tip of your fingers, comes all around you like a big bubble, and you can think of that as your space, and the only person who is really supposed to be inside that space is you. Who you are, your spirit, your thoughts, your feelings, what you want, what you need, what you envision, your life purpose, your karma, whatever it is, that's supposed to be in your space, inside your energy field. And everybody else's energy fields is supposed to be in, everybody else's reality, to use that word, of who they are, is supposed to be in their space. But what happens when you're codependent, we lose the defined edge of our space and we start blending together. So being codependent is confusion about who you are. Not just because the 5 freedoms were taken away from you, but also because we take in other people's stuff. So learning about boundaries and learning to recognize when to set boundaries is also about having the awareness, or having enough awareness, self-awareness to say, wait a minute, this is not my stuff, it doesn't belong here. Or recognizing that you have a choice whether you want it into your life or not. So when we talk about boundary problems, it's very helpful to look at the different types of boundaries we have. We have the external boundary that has to do with what is coming from outside towards us. What of that stuff do we allow to come into our space? That is a choice we have, and most of us haven't realized yet to what extent we actually have that choice. Sometimes we don't need to say anything, it's just a decision. I don't want this in my life anymore. And the decision, our internal shift because of that decision, is enough to prevent that from happening. Other times we need to give voice to our boundaries, and we need to bring it into conscious awareness of life around us, whether it's a person or whatever it is. A different kind of boundary is the one that has to do with things coming from you going into the world. What is acceptable to you that you send out into life? And let me just go on to the third one. And the third boundary is the one that has to do with what comes from you and goes toward yourself, which is really to do with how we treat ourselves. How do you want to treat yourself? And this is, in all 3 levels we need to set boundaries and sort out what do we want and what do we not want in our space. So when we look at the things that's coming towards you from the outside, how do you want people to treat you? It is your responsibility to make that choice, and it's your responsibility to see that that choice is communicated and honored by other people. That's your responsibility, to separate yourself from what's outside you in that way. The same thing, it's your responsibility to consciously choose what you allow to come out of your inner reality and bring it out into the world. So one example that comes to mind very easily is that of name-calling people that you don't like, or putting them down, or dumping your anger on them, or whatever it can be. Are these really things that is appropriate? And when I talk about boundaries and codependence in general, a good guiding word is what is appropriate. What is healthy, what is functional, what's appropriate. Most of us know the times when we said something that it would have been better if we hadn't said. We know that because of how we feel afterwards. It was not a self-respecting thing to do. So again, we come back to, boundaries is really also about self-respect, especially when it comes to the boundary that has to do with what's inside you going out into the world. So self-respect, where is the boundary lacking? Where are the holes in your boundary, the things you really don't want to send out into the world? They're being sent out there anyway because you don't have the boundary. And then there's a boundary that has to do with how you treat yourself. It's a lot of codependent people, and I have been there, so I know it very well. They are merciless, ruthless, nasty, super critical and super judgmental of themselves. Is that really the way you want to treat yourself? And that again is actually a lack of boundary. It's a different kind of internal boundary. We have the external, we have the internal. This is sort of a double internal boundary, if you want to use that word. And this is a place where we have a choice too. We can decide if that is an appropriate way to treat ourselves, if that is really what we want for ourselves. Boundaries is, what do I want me to be? What do I want inside my life experience? That has to do with what's your inner reality, what's your outer reality. It's all part of your life. So, looking at the internal boundary again, think about, how do you talk to yourself? Do you want to have a boundary against your negative self-talk? As one example. So my own experience was, when I was working with healing my own boundaries and firming them and creating them and actually discovering where they were, was that the easiest boundary was actually the one that had to do with what's coming from outside into me. And what always amazes me is, like, once you kind of decide what it is that you want to experience in your space and in your life, both inside and outside, it's like life kind of adjusts itself to reflect your decision immediately. So one of my external boundaries was that I didn't want people to show up late for appointments. And I just decided I would rather find another job than having people not be respectful of my time. Which of course was a lack of boundary. I didn't have a boundary that said, you need to show up on time. And I allowed people to show up late for appointments, creating a lot of frustration and frustrated clients who actually came on time but had to wait for their time because somebody was going over time. So I made that decision. I'm not going to do this anymore. It's too much frustration, it's too much stress, it doesn't serve me anything but giving me money, and I can get money somewhere else. As soon as I set that boundary, which is really what it is, people actually started showing up 10 minutes early. And it was such a drastic example of how making a decision about what you want in your life, what you don't and what you don't want in your life. The internal shift that happened in me as a result of discovering where my boundary was immediately changed the reality of how people approach me. It changed in an instant, between two clients actually, from being late to being 10 minutes early. And it has stayed that way, for the rest of my time since then, that seeing clients now, they either a little bit early, they're right on time, or when I actually need them to be late, that's when they're late. And all of that is the only thing that changed was that I decided what I wanted to experience in my life. The only thing it was, I made a conscious choice, and I think that's an important ingredient. I was willing to act on my choice, to enforce it. I was willing to make a different kind of income. I was willing to work a different job. So again, boundaries have so much to do about what do you want to be part of your reality? What experiences do you want to have? How do you want to feel about yourself inside? And always, 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 it comes down to choices and decisions based on what you want. So there's no magic cure for boundaries, and my experience has been that life tends to put you into new situations to help you clarify what you want and what you don't want. Or saying it in different words is, life has a way of putting you into new situations to help you clarify even more of your boundaries. So each new situation and each new experience requires that you develop that self-awareness, that you grow or discover or find that self-awareness to also know who you are in that situation and also what you want in that situation. As a codependent, we have damaged boundary systems. And again, if you look at or if you visualize that your boundary is at the edge of your energy field, at the edge of your aura, then one of the ways we have boundary damages is we have holes in our boundaries. And I think it's very easy to visualize if you look at your edge of your aura, instead of being a smooth surface, that you really bounce back all the things that you don't want. There's holes where things can get into you from the outside. And I know that most of you know or have had the experience of taking things way too personally. It's a very, very common experience for codependent people is to feel things that are not meant personally, but they go in and they become your personal experience. They're not about you, but because you don't have the boundary to bounce them back, they come into you and they feel uncomfortable, and you know they're not right because they're actually not your reality. Another way of having a damaged boundary is that some people, it's easy for you to speak your truth to, other people it's not. You become the mouse around other people who don't have a reality of his or her own. Typically, this is family members, non-family members. And it can go either way. I have heard both versions that it's easier to have boundaries around your family members, or it's easier to have boundaries around non-family members. It seems to be an individual preference, if I may use this word. Another kind of boundary damage is actually to not have one at all. There is nothing that separates you from the rest of the world, and that means you're wide open to everything, and everything that's happening around you goes right into your space. And it's a very, very, very painful way to live, because there is no protection, whether it's emotional or mental or energetic protection also. you're wide open to everything, and it becomes overwhelming. And with it comes also the sense that you're constantly finding yourself in reaction mode to everything that's coming towards you. You never have the space to know who you are from the inside. You live a constant reaction. And then you have walls. And walls, again, is like, you put up walls to protect yourself because it hurts. It's very, very painful to not to have any boundaries at all. But walls, while they can protect you, they also keep you lonely because there's no connection with other people through the walls. And Pia Melody beautifully describes at least 4 types of walls. One of them is the wall of anger. And I think we have all had experiences of meeting people with a wall of anger. I recognize those people by the fact that I tiptoe around them. It's like walking on eggshells. You don't know, you watch yourself for, should I say this? Is it safe to say this? Or is it safe to say it in this way? Because if you don't get it exactly right, you're going to get a growl or a volcanic eruption of fury in your face, or an angry remark or a snide remark or whatever, if you don't get it exactly right. So those people, they protect themselves behind a wall of anger. And come to think about it, it's a very high energy wall to have around you. It takes a lot of energy to keep all that anger going all the time. Another wall is the wall of fear. There's some people, they project such an aura, such a sense of fear that they're so fragile, that again, you have to be very careful how you talk to them. You make your voice soft, you watch your body language, you try to be very gentle with them, because you know they can't handle it, they're going to fall apart. And you can't come on too strong about who you are, because that's going to send them running away. So wall of fear is something you also find very often. It's maybe very often recognized more as a shyness or being reserved. Both of those are actually types of fear, the types of walls of fear, especially the shyness is a wall of fear. Then there is a wall of words. There are people that talk and 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 talk, but they're not really saying anything. And they're not really interested in having a conversation with you. They use words to keep a safe distance between them and other people. They fill up the space between you with words, so there's no way you can connect with them. And a story around this, I once had a blind date with a guy, and he started talking. And then he talked and 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 talked, till I eventually said, you know, I would like to say something too. Could you give me a space to say something in? So I got my one sentence in, and then he was off talking again. And obviously we didn't meet again. But it's interesting, you know, it's like, because a date really has to do with I want to connect with somebody else, but rather that this person didn't have the courage to connect. He needed to protect himself. So, walls of silence. People who never say anything. They put this cloud of silence around them and this message, leave me alone. So they don't share anything of themselves with the outside world. They use silence to create a buffer between themselves and other people. Now, of these walls, two of them were my own. I used to have the wall of fear and the wall of silence. And in my case, the wall of silence was very dramatic in my younger years, where I actually only talked to about 5 people. I was silent around other people. I was silent throughout all my school years. So I do know that behind walls, you put up these walls and you think you're safe, but you actually aren't. You still feel very open and very vulnerable. A wall is not a boundary. So when people with walls start to heal their codependence, they tend to shift between having their walls up and then going into a place of having no boundary, where they are then wide open. And that's such a painful existence. It's even worse than being behind the wall, that they switch back into living behind the wall again. So there's this back and forth movement, and somewhere in the space between no boundaries and walls, they will discover where the true boundaries are. And this is where you want to get to, because we all have our boundaries. Or that has been my experience, at least, that we actually already know where our boundaries are, but we need to rediscover them, because we have been, disallowed. We have not been allowed to respect our own boundaries and our dysfunctional family upbringing, so we have to rediscover where they are. So in a way, wanting to know your boundaries is a journey of self-discovery. Where do I end? Where does the rest of the world begin? What do I want inside my space? What do I not want? What is me? What is not me? And then once we discover where our boundaries are, and you recognize them, there's a recognition of, oops, I wasn't honoring my boundary, whether it was the external, the internal, or the double internal. I didn't honor it. And now I feel bad. I realize that I feel bad because I wasn't honoring where my boundary was. So one interesting thing, and one interesting question is, how do I know? How do I discover a boundary? And I can share my own experiences, that what has been very helpful to me is, again, to focus on what do I feel. I talked about it previously, that feelings are messages from ourselves to ourselves. So feelings, how I felt in any given situation, my feelings would tell me, did I not honor my boundaries? Resentment is a very important feeling to notice in your codependence recovery, and I will talk more about it at a later time. But resentment is one of those feelings that will come up when you have allowed somebody to overstep your boundary, which is actually not the other person doing it, but you not taking responsibility for communicating your boundaries. Resentment at the other person, towards the other person. Another feeling you can feel is just a general feeling of let down, that you have let yourself down, you have not respected yourself. Another feeling could be frustration with yourself because you didn't communicate it. You didn't show the world, you didn't let the world know where your boundary is. Anger is maybe a stronger form of resentment. So these are all feelings that will show you where you have not honored and respected your own individual boundaries. So when we start learning about boundaries, one of the things we also have to think about is, how often do we comply and say yes automatically without never stopping to ask ourselves, is this really what I want? Boundaries is, yes, about learning how to say no, but we learn how to say no by noticing and becoming aware of all the times we're saying yes without even knowing we have a choice, without even stopping to take this pause to self-reflect. Is this what I want? Is that not what I want? And when I use the words yes and no, it's not necessarily the word yes or the word no. It's more, do you want to invite it in, or do you want to exclude it from your life? So the word yes is an inward movement. The word no is an outward movement. So I had one client several years ago who had realized in the course of his therapy with me that he was saying yes all the time. And it's not necessarily the actual word yes, but he was inviting everything in. He was a people pleaser. He was just going along with somebody else's reality without even stopping and thinking about what he wanted. So I gave him the exercise of, between this week's session and next week's session, to say no 3 times. And he came back the week after in utter shock to what extent he said automatic yeses. And I think for this particular client, that was a huge turning point in his recovery, to see really, really, really clearly how he had just always gone along with somebody else's reality, which is really what lack of boundaries are, or is. So, beginning to notice how you just go along with somebody else's reality. Is that really what you want? Or do you want to stop and say, no, wait a minute, I want to say no to this person's reality in order to say yes to my own. And I want to point out here that saying no to another person's reality is not a rejection of that person. It is not about rejecting a person. It might be about protecting yourself from that person's behavior in cases of boundary violation. I'm thinking verbal, sexual, emotional abuse. Physical abuse also, where you really need to protect yourself from the behavior. It can just be about, I'm not going to help you out because I want to spend time with my family. Saying yes to how you want to experience your life, and saying no for the moment, for the time being, to how other people want to include you in their reality, in their life experiences. And I believe it's your responsibility, and in a way your moral obligation, to know this and communicate it. Because when you don't, you end up feeling resentment. So one of the questions I bring to people is, what are your reasons for not saying no? How come you're not saying no? How come you're not honoring your boundary? And typical answers is, I'm afraid that the other person will get angry at me, and here we're talking mostly about the external boundary, by the way. I'm afraid of hurting somebody. I'm afraid that I'll be rejected, that the person is not going to like me anymore, whatever. But these are just fears. And when you accommodate your fears, you're always, always, always letting yourself down. Because again, this is a case of going along with somebody else's reality instead of honoring the truth about who you are and what you want your life to be. And every time you do that, there's a price. And I'm just coming to my mind right now is one of my aha moments in my codependence recovery, when I realized that every time I did not honor my truth, every time I let myself down by not speaking up or by not saying no or being a people pleaser, whatever, my soul died a little bit. And it was very, very clear to me at that aha moment that that was what was actually happening. And that's when I started turning it around. So that was a peak moment for me, a real turning point in my codependence recovery. There was no way I was going to kill my soul. You know, even if slowly doing it bit by bit, that was not what I wanted out of life. So that was one of the things that really helped me to take responsibility for who I wanted to be and what I wanted to experience in my life. And I recall clearly that when I started honoring my boundaries and communicating to the world, there was a lot of fear in me about how people would react to me. And everything, of course, was fine, but the fear was very, very strong. And what had kept me from communicating or sharing my boundaries in the past. And most, it was the strongest fear was the fear of being abandoned. That people wouldn't want me or wouldn't want to have a relationship with me anymore. If I was honest about where my boundaries were. So one of the things that can guide you through the jungle of learning, discovering your boundaries is self-respect. Self-respect is a wonderful guide in many ways. It will help you grow your self-esteem, your self-confidence, but it will also help you learn about where your boundaries are. So what are your self-respecting choices? We all have had experience when, why didn't I speak up? I should have said something, but you didn't. So if you learn to catch those moments at the time they are happening, you can ask yourself, what's a self-respecting choice? And do something different. And this is how we recover from our codependence, is choosing to do something different. Stephen Covey made famous the quote, between stimulus and response there is a pause. And in that pause we have the power to choose for ourselves. So much of codependence is living on automatic. So much about healing our codependence is to catch that pause between stimulus and response and consciously choose. And then act on our choice no matter how we feel about it. The reason we're staying in our codependence is because we fear the consequences if we stop being codependent. What are people gonna think about us? Maybe they're not gonna want us anymore, the fear of abandonment. So it takes courage. It takes a lot of courage to step out of your codependence, doing it in spite of the fear of what people would think. Or for many people it's about fearing God's punishment if you choose something that is self-respecting and good for yourself. So how can we do this? You know, how can we practice saying no? How can we begin to become aware of where our boundaries are? Because we can't communicate them until we know where they are. So we can start practicing. We can start practicing saying baby no's, easy no's, and leave the big boundaries, the big problems in our life. We can leave them until we have built some confidence in ourselves. We have learned from experience that Nobody's going to die if I say no. Nobody's going to die if I'm not there all the time. Nobody's going to die if I say, no, I'd rather focus on myself right now than coming into you. Coming in to help you with whatever it is that you wanted. Or nobody's going to die if I say no to a dinner invitation. People are going to do just fine. So, boundaries, we start small, and we build up to the big ones. And we start saying practice no's. Do the baby no's and build up to the big ones. We need to build our boundary momentum. We need to build our boundary yeses. Or, sorry, our boundary no's. And again, it starts with self-awareness. Self-awareness leads to self-honesty, which leads to communicating your boundaries. Discovering where your boundaries are is a question of self-awareness, self-honesty. And until you have those things in place first, you can't communicate or show the world where your boundaries are. Now, talking about boundaries, Byron Katie taught us that there is my business, your business, and God's business. So my business is my thoughts, my feelings, my choices, my behavior, my dreams, my goals, my passions, whatever. Your business is your thoughts, your feelings, your choices, your decisions, what you want, what your dreams are, what your goals, your purpose in life, whatever. And God's business is everything else. So part of the external boundary and the internal boundary is knowing to stay in your own business, not going over into other people's business, and vice versa. Helping other people stay in their own business and not allowing them to come into your space, into your business. So for example, I would have a feeling, I would share with my friends what kind of feeling I had. My friend would step into my space and tell me I should not have that feeling. My feeling is my business, and until I communicate that I want some advice from you, from inside your space, you can watch, you can witness my business, but you have no right to step into it. Vice versa, I have no right to step into your space unless I'm invited to share it. And this also has to do with self-responsibility, taking responsibility for what is my reality and what is your reality. We don't switch responsibilities even though we try to in our codependence. I'm not responsible for your feelings, you're not responsible for my feelings. I am not responsible for your thoughts, you're not responsible for my thoughts. Back and forth. So also boundaries is sorting out, again, coming back down to what is my stuff and what is not my stuff. What is me, what is not me. And keeping it clear for yourself will help other people keep it clear for themselves. Boundaries exist on many different levels. And just as we talked about with the self-care and self-nurture, we have a physical area of life, we have a mental area of life, mental, spiritual, emotional, financial, around work, around our family, around our social life. In all these areas too, we have boundaries. And it's a very good exercise to, just like we did for the self-care and self-nurture, is to look at where are my boundaries in all these different areas of life, and to notice where you have a good healthy boundary, where you have holes in your boundaries, where you don't have any boundaries at all, and where you might have a wall. And some of these boundaries are self-evident, but when it comes to the mental boundary, are you allowing other people's thoughts to become your own? Are you just repeating what the expert said? I think I talked about that before. That is not having a clear boundary, and what are my thoughts, what is another person's thoughts? With feelings also, whose feelings are you feeling? Which is empathy, but it's also about having the internal boundary. Is about knowing how to keep your feelings in your space and feeling them in your space, not putting them into another person's space, not making your feelings another person's business, and holding them responsible for what you're feeling. Which is a tendency, which is what we have learned to do as codependents. You cause this feeling, you are to blame for my feeling, and therefore you have to fix the way I feel. And it's one of the things that we bring into marriages, for example, intimate relationships, is we switch relationships. We switch responsibilities for feelings. This is the romantic fantasy we have, that I will make you happy and you will make me happy forever after. And we all know what reality is, but this is the fantasy, the illusion that many people bring into a marriage. And those of us who have families, we know how important boundaries are in different areas of family life. Getting everybody ready in the morning, getting the dishes done, who does the shopping, who does the housework, how are the finances kept. All these are really issues of boundaries. The same thing with your own personal money situation. How are you handling your money? Do you have a boundary against not overspending? Do you have a boundary with saving, investing? What are your financial boundaries? And so on. You can go through all the areas of your life, like we did with the self-nurture, and reflect all those areas, go through them again, and notice where you have boundaries and where your boundaries can use some discovering and honoring. But bringing this to an end, I think that one of the most interesting aspects of having damaged boundaries is that it prevents you from actually completely and utterly saying yes. When you can't say an honest no, you can't say an honest yes. When you can't say an honest no, all your yeses are no's in disguise, or a maybe, or a yes, but I really resent that I'm saying yes. It's not until you have within you the freedom to say no when that's your truth, that there becomes a space available for saying a heartfelt yes. And maybe that's the most important reason to develop your boundaries, is just so that you can experience the joy of totally, utterly saying yes to something. And I think that's a good point of ending this part of the Codependence lecture series with.